And this lecture will be a really quick overview of kind of a comparison of whole foods to processed or refined, whole food carbohydrates compared to processed refined carbohydrates. So here's a really simple little infographic. And again, hopefully as you're listening to these lectures, you're this point is hitting home for you. So our naturally occurring foods, we call whole food carbohydrates. So anything from fruit to vegetables, to starchy vegetables, to beans, peas, and lentils, to whole grains and corn. These are really our whole food carbohydrates. For those of us who just can't stop eating pasta, depending on who you talk to and what day, we would include various types of foods made from whole grains that where the whole grain did not go through any processing except to become milled to make the flour to make the noodle. So if you look on the ingredients list and you see things like whole wheat or brown rice or ground lentils or quinoa flour or bean flour or chickpea flour, then we know that there was no refining before the milling. So we kind of make a little assumption that these still contain some of the original minerals and vitamins that the whole grain had originally. And so again, understanding pretty straightforward that all of these foods naturally are very high in fiber, very high in water, very high in antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. So that's what your whole food carbohydrate is. And then the refined carbohydrate is, again, anything really man-made or manufactured. So hopefully it's obvious to all of us that candies, sodas, all sorts of pastries, and I would say cereals, most cereals across the board, but particularly really, really sweet and artificially colored cereals are very much refined processed foods. Also really interesting and worth noting these different grain foods down here. So white rices, white flour pastas, white flour breads. The difference from on the left side of your screen is that the grain, the wheat here that originally existed before we made the flour to make the pasta or the bread, at one point was in whole grain form. But when we process it, we, again, as you saw in the previous lecture, we start to pull out the fiber, we pull out the water, we pull out the antioxidants, we pull out a lot of the vitamins and the minerals, and so we're left with a really nutritionally devoid or empty food, and then we mill that into a flour and make pasta or bread. So these types of foods tend to be higher in, not higher, but they still provide calories, but at the same time, they don't provide any or if very little, if at all, fiber, very little, if at all, nutrients, and in some cases, they have added to them different chemicals that are sometimes not naturally occurring or sometimes derived from things like wood pulp that we don't typically eat in the human diet. So these foods, not only have they lost their original, for some of them, their original nutrient content, they've also had various things added into them that don't in any way lead into human health. So these next two slides kind of look through what a whole grain is, because there's a lot of confusion around that lately. But a real true whole grain is just the seed of some grass plant. So rice or wheat, oats, barley, rye, lots of different types of wheats, some different types of oats, but we've kind of narrowed our food supply down here in the past couple hundred years, so we mostly only see one type of wheat, but historically all grains were like tomatoes or peppers, right? There'd be tons of different varieties of them, but in modern times we really kind of see one main variety with wheat and oat and different other grains. But anyhow, the whole grain would naturally contain these three parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. So the bran, I think we're all kind of familiar with. That's like the rough outer shell. That's where we'd find a lot of the insoluble fibers. And then the endosperm is kind of the main part of the inner part of the seed. This is where we would see a lot of the glucose being stored. And the germ is kind of akin to the egg, the little white part in the egg. The germ is what would become the next plant. So this part's going to be pretty high in various minerals, B vitamins, and fairly high in proteins. But what we do when we a grain, so the whole grain naturally contains all three of those, but the refined grain is really just the endosperm. So really just the carbohydrate part minus the fiber, minus B vitamins, minus minerals, minus more B vitamins, minus any proteins, minus healthy fats. So the refined grain really becomes, again, providing energy, but no other nutritional value. And so here, just for visual sake, these are some whole wheat berries is what we would, that's how we call the wheat seed. We say wheat berry. And this is typically what we mill. First we refine and then we mill it down into a flour. And that's what we make a lot of our processed foods out of. And then just to kind of draw the connection between agriculture and what we eat, right? All this stuff is grown, and we've kind of switched from an old way of harvesting or growing food to kind of what we call modern day industrial agriculture. So it is very industrial. And you see some of these, the farming machinery these days looks like almost like military type equipment, but it's a very, very big machinery, and folks are farming thousands of acres of just the same singular crop. So at the end of this course, we look a little bit more into this kind of issue of how we grow our food and how that starts to impact the environment at large, in addition. So here in the olden days, we used to just harvest wheat by hand. But as you saw in the previous slide, we have these big sort of monstrous tractors to cut down the wheat and then start to pull the berries off of the plant. Again, just sort of showing this scale of how we're doing this. And another thing that's interesting to note is that as I have kind of alluded to in the grocery store, most food that's available in the grocery store is some concoction of very processed, refined wheat. And so it's really interesting that we grow so much of it and process so much of it to make so much junk food. We could theoretically consider that this land could go to growing, various different types of wheat or various different types of vegetables, right? Or could just maybe have been left to be natural land. So it's kind of interesting that we grow so much of one type of crop and then we turn it all into processed junk food. Here is your flow chart, basically, of how flour is milled. So I won't go through this in too much detail, but take your time if you want to kind of check through it. What you'll notice is that there's a lot of mechanical processing, and then there's also some chemical processing too, where chemicals are applied to the grain. Particularly one stands out to me, which is bleaching at the end to get it from sort of the original brownish, gray, tan, beige color to a real white color. And yes, that's bleach like we would use in home cleaning bleach. So, theoretically something we don't want to eat. And here's my little chicken scratch. So here is also like the visual, the other pictorial flow diagram. So in the top left, these are all your whole grains, different varieties of rices, corn, oats, millet, probably some amaranth, some buckwheat. So lots of different types of grains there. And then we might do the processing, extracting pulling off the fiber and the antioxidants and the minerals and the vitamins. We're left with these white flours. And then from the white flour, as I've said, we make the majority of the food that we eat here in the United States. So my little key code here, CC is for complex carbohydrates. They have a low glycemic load when they're in their whole grain form. As we move through the processing, we wind up with foods that are really very simple sugars with a very high glycemic load, high glycemic index. So just starting to be aware of what our food is actually and how our bodies respond to them. And then just revisiting this picture again to kind of drive the point home, the difference between whole foods and refined carbohydrates. And I do this because there's been a lot of talk in the popular media lately about how carbohydrates are bad and they cause all these diseases and that we need to go on low carbohydrate diets. And really that's unfortunately pretty horribly misleading because as we're seeing, as we're starting to understand, carbohydrates really are an essential. They are perhaps the second most essential nutrient to water. So it's not carbohydrates that we need to be focusing on, it's actually the quality of the carbohydrate. So the human body needs to take in carbohydrate to be healthy, but we need to take in these types of whole food carbohydrates. Whereas these refined processed food-like substances, these are not in any way promoting health. And these are the types of, yes, carbohydrate foods, though not naturally occurring, but these are the types of carbohydrate foods that lead to disease and dishealth. So just starting to understand that bigger picture there with carbohydrates.